There is a question I keep coming back to. When was the last time you were truly still? And I don't mean asleep or waiting for something, just present, quiet, with no particular thing in front of you and nothing in particular to do. And you were also feeling peaceful and at peace with that. For most people I know, myself included, that kind of stillness has become genuinely uncomfortable. We feel it almost before we notice we're doing it. And I think we need to pay attention to it. There's a design dimension to it that should be mentioned. So apparently the average person checks their phone over 90 times a day. And the platforms that we use are built by software engineers who very precisely understand how attention works and how to hold it. So whether it's the infinite scroll, the reward of the next notification, or the perfect recommendation in your feed. None of this is accidental. But what I find less troubling is the engineering than what I actually notice in myself, because the pull toward the screen for me rarely comes from simple boredom. It comes almost automatically, as if I was constantly grabbing my phone on autopilot without even thinking about it. That's where media consumption stops being a bad habit and starts being more like an addiction. The phone becomes a new reality to distract me from any sorts of discomforts of everyday life. And once you see it that way, it starts to feel like a question we should take seriously. Not just practically, but also spiritually and for our religious lives. Blaise Pascal wrote in 1654, so way before television, radio, the internet, long before any of this, that all of humanity's problems stem from man's inability to sit quietly in a room. He called it diversion, a compulsion to keep moving, to keep consuming, to keep the mind occupied with something external, something outside of ourselves. And he also understood it as a flight from self-knowledge. We fill our hours so that we don't have to face the silence that might show us something about ourselves. And then there were also the early Christian monastics, writing more than even 1,000 years before Pascal, who had their own word for describing it. They called it Acedia. It often gets translated as sloth, but I think that misses it a little bit. Acedia is more like a spiritual restlessness, a soul that can't stay present, that keeps drifting toward the exit, looking for somewhere else to be. What I find striking is how precisely that maps onto something we can recognize for our time as well. The structure of the problem hasn't changed. We've just found faster and more frictionless ways to indulge it with all the technology we have access to today. Now, I want to be specific about what I think we actually lose to distraction, because I don't think it's just productivity that we lose. What gets lost is something harder to name and more important. The first thing is self-knowledge. There's a kind of clarity that only comes from prolonged stillness, from sitting with your own thoughts long enough to actually hear them, without reaching for something to drown them out. When I'm in a period of heavy distraction, I notice that I start to lose with what I actually think, what I actually feel, what's actually going on underneath the surface inside of me. The second thing is prayer. Genuine interior prayer requires a kind of recollection, right? A gathering of attention inwards that a fragmented and distracted attention can't sustain. When the mind has been scattered all day by input and stimulation, the sitting down to pray is like trying to have a real conversation in a room where everyone is shouting. And then there's also what it does to presence with other people. To be fully attentive to someone, not partly there, not half listening while something else pulls you into a different direction. I think that's one of the most fundamental ways we love and care for each other. And I think that capacity is quietly eroding and disappearing. And we're not talking enough about this, especially from a religious point of view. Now, that being said, I'm not going to pretend I've solved this. I'm still working on this almost every day. But I found a few things that help, and they all share something in common. The most important is probably the simplest: recovering silence in the morning. So before the phone, before the day starts demanding things from me, even for 10 minutes, just sitting in silence for 10 minutes. In the beginning, it often feels a bit uncomfortable, but I also think that's the point when you're just getting started and you're not used to it. Because the discomfort is actually information. It tells you how used you have become to never being with yourself and how much it actually matters for you to start again. And then there's also an old idea that you can find in many of the contemplative monastic traditions, and that's about being intentional with what you allow in. What you give your attention to shapes you gradually, right? In ways that in the moment might be very hard to see, but they become clear over time. And I think this principle now feels more urgent than it ever has been. And another thing for me personally is also regular examination, not in a punishing way, but in a way that's honest to myself. So at the end of the day, I will sit down and ask myself a few questions like, where was I present today? Where did I drift? What was I avoiding and why? That kind of honest self reflection, I think, is also an act of resistance to distraction itself, actually. It's kind of a refusal to let the day pass without looking at it. None of these are very big activities, but I think that's okay. So the response to distraction can't be dramatic, but it has to be habitual. It needs to be practiced as small recoveries consistently over a long period of time. And then there's also St. Augustine, who famously wrote, as most of you know, that our hearts are restless until they rest in God. And I think that's also a line that feels very familiar and is very appropriate for this context. The restlessness we're talking about, the need for the next thing, the discomfort of stillness, the drifting towards whatever can occupy the mind, that's, to be honest, that's not a flaw. It's natural. It's part of the human condition. But it's also a longing that has been misdirected. Something in us is genuinely reaching for something. We've just become very good at feeding it with things that don't really satisfy it deeply enough. I also don't think the answer is less technology, but I think it's more inwardness and more interiority, more willingness to be present to yourself, to what's actually there and underneath the noise. That's uncomfortable, but I also think that's where everything that matters begins. Anyway, I'd love to hear what you think about this, and I'll see you in the next one.